In the world of policy, politicians and the electorate alike fall into the trap of seeing things, perhaps sometimes simplistically, through the scope of problems and solutions. But in reality, it's rarely so straightforward. In policy, practically everything is a trade-off, which is why a cost-benefit analysis of every policy is crucial. During the rise of Omicron, SAGE published modelling that suggested its effects could be disastrous. But it emerged that the modelling hadn't taken into account the possibility that Omicron was weaker than the preceding variants. It was simply wrong. The scenarios that the body set out were doom and gloom, but Boris Johnson resisted the pressure to lock down, which came both from SAGE and the Labour Party, and he was vindicated by that decision. He kept Christmas going. The problem with lockdowns was that they were political decisions being treated as scientific decisions. Instead, often with erroneous or misleading data, they led to us doing the wrong thing. And the science may have suggested that lockdowns would help stifle the spread of COVID, but this was not fact, simply an assumption based on modelling, which is in and of itself inherently inaccurate. A scientist will talk of hypothesis, theory and law, whereas the scientist is always assumed to be law. So when people say the science, they think it means law, not the hypothesis or the theory that precedes the proof required for law, and is of course not what the scientists themselves claim. Thus, the job of the politician is to assess the costs and benefits along with the probability. They cannot just consider the, quote, science, because that doesn't really exist in the simplistic way that it's put across. The politicians have to consider the array of economic, political and even mental health costs incurred by decisions such as lockdown. And they have to consider the trade-offs. We may have been able to stop the spread of Omicron if we had locked down completely, but that could have made an even greater contribution to inflation, the disruption of supply chains and other health effects caused not least by delays in the National Health Service. So, what's this got to do with ULEZ? Well, the same applies, as it's finally been expanded into Outer London today. The Mayor of London, at every turn when questioned about his decision to charge hundreds of thousands of the least well-off Londoners £12.50 for every journey they take, has talked about the science, and he's alluded to the alleged 4,000 Londoners dying from air pollution every year, which is a figure that can be easily unpicked, and it turns out not to be a number that you can actually sensibly justify. He presents ULEZ, which he calls a difficult decision, as a scientific one, not a political one. But in fact, it's very much a political decision, even if it will help London's air quality marginally, with an anticipated 0.1% decline in particulates and 1.4% decline in nitrogen oxide. There are other factors to consider, such as the cost of living crisis, and that this policy hits the worst off the hardest. And the strategy has been to obstruct criticism. To disagree with Mr. Khan, as I've said, is to disagree with the science. And to disagree with the science is to be a conspiracy theorist and an extremist. So let's look at the science. Pollution is often measured through what is called suspended particulate matter, which refers to fine, solid or liquid particles of smoke, dust or soot suspended in the Earth's atmosphere. It's been linked to various negative health effects. London's rate of suspended particulate matter is 1/40th of its peak in the 19th century. It wasn't ULEZ that got us to this point either. It was innovation. Only about 12% of particulate matter is caused by transport. Pollution is also measured through nitrogen dioxides, which are down 77% over the last 3 decades. Again, not because of ULEZ, but because of innovation. The link between nitrogen dioxide and morbidity isn't entirely clear, but it's obviously not something that you want to breathe in too much of. But what this suggests is that London is actually cleaner than it has been since probably before the Industrial Revolution, let alone since the Industrial Revolution. You won't hear that from the Mayor's office. Perhaps most importantly, though, it seems the Mayor has been quite selective with the science. It's been claimed that an Imperial College London study has suggested that central London ULEZ, which is already in place, reduced nitrogen oxides by 29%. But an academic from the college's environmental research group, which received £80,000 worth of funding from the Mayor's office, simply reviewed the methodology of the report which came from City Hall in the first place. When a team of Imperial College scientists look at the actual data, they suggested ULEZ had reduced nitrogen dioxide by just 3%, and that it had had a negligible effect on particulate pollution. Mr Khan has claimed that pollution-related deaths, as I mentioned earlier, are much higher in outer London, which is why ULEZ is needed to expand. He failed to explain this is largely because outer London's population is much older than that in central London. Mr Khan and his team have claimed that 90% of cars in outer London are already ULEZ compliant, but the RAC's figures suggest that at least a quarter of cars would be paying the charge. And as we discussed last night, emails between Mr Khan's deputy and a professor from Queen Mary University showed she asked him to reword a study's findings about central London ULEZ that said, despite these improvements in air quality, there was no evidence of a reduction in the proportion of children with small lungs or asthma symptoms over this period. The point is that this is not as clear-cut as the Mayor has made out, and he has selected the science that suits his agenda. But that is a fundamentally unscientific thing to do. But more than this, it's high time that the Mayor admitted that it's a political, not a scientific, decision. He may tell us that we need to follow the science, but perhaps he should find out what that actually means first.